In 1901, in the forgotten folds of Kentucky's Appalachian heartland, a brief and unsigned clinical note was entered into a misfiled mining infirmary log, a footnote to a history that was never meant to be written. It began a story not of a family, but of an echo that had learned to breathe. The note was stark, clinical, and utterly devoid of human warmth. It read, "Boy, 12, overlapping jaw lines, eyes incorrect." There was no name, no diagnosis, just a cold observation of a life that defied the simple categories of medicine. But it was the second entry, penned by the same hand but shakier, more disturbed, that truly opened the door to the abyss. Girl, limbs mirror backward. The reflex response to light is delayed, tongue silent but not still. These two entries are the only ones on that torn patient tag. They appear once, like ghosts in the machine of bureaucracy, and then vanish forever. At the time, official records claimed no children were living in that specific hollow. The census data, when you dig deep enough to find it, is even more chilling. It shows only 3 households on that entire ridge, and the entries are just a repeating loop of first names, unattached to any surname. Uncle, mama, uncle, mama. A closed circuit. A family tree that had folded in on itself until its roots and branches were indistinguishable. They existed outside of the systems meant to track us, to define us. No graves, no marriage licenses, no travel permits. It was as if a small pocket of humanity had been excised from time itself, living by rules that the outside world had long forgotten, or perhaps had never been allowed to learn. You're not supposed to know this, but some places don't just hold secrets, they are secrets. And this hollow, this place was a secret that was beginning to bleed through. 86 years later, a state survey crew, men of science and measurement, would report finding a cabin in that same hollow while clearing land for a road that no one wanted. The cabin wasn't just abandoned, it felt paused. Inside, they found 6 chairs arranged around a rough-hewn table. On that table sat 5 steaming plates of food: stew, cornbread, greens. The wood stove in the corner was still warm to the touch. It was a scene of domestic life, frozen in the middle of a breath. But no one had been seen entering or leaving that hollow for generations. The path was overgrown, swallowed by rhododendron and shadow. The visitor log by the door, a small, leather-bound book thick with dust, had only one line written in it, 4 times over in the same looping, uncertain hand. The same name. A name that belonged to no one and everyone in that place. To understand this impossible scene, you have to go back further. You have to go back to the storm that started it all. In the early spring of 1874, a thunderstorm of biblical proportions swept down the ridge above a place they called Still Hollow. Old farmers, men who knew the moods of the sky like the faces of their own children, remembered that night not for its rain or its thunder, but for its light. A peculiar light, they said. White, like sun-bleached bone. A light that didn't illuminate, it exposed. And it was in that storm, beneath a collapsing birch tree and a leaking tin roof, that a woman named Marian Delling gave birth, utterly and terrifyingly alone. The midwife, when she finally arrived, was a harbinger of the confusion to come, a witness to a truth that she herself would spend the rest of her life trying to deny. The midwife's name was Rebecca Twill, a woman known throughout the county for her calm hands and unwavering precision. But on that night she arrived soaked, shaking, and already a step behind reality. Her journal entry, written later by the weak light of a kerosene lamp, is a testament to her professional duty struggling against an encroaching dread. She wrote only, "One girl, quiet, breathing weakly, alone by the fire when I arrived." A simple, factual account. 1 birth, 1 child. Yet by dawn there were 2. 2 infants wrapped in identical woolen shawls lay on opposite sides of the hearth. Neither cried. Both blinked at once, a slow, rhythmic pulse as if they were a single organism testing the light for the first time. Rebecca would later confess to the parish pastor that she must have erred. "Perhaps one was hidden," she'd said, her voice a whisper. "Perhaps I was too tired to see what was already there." But her written record, her official testimony to the event, never changed. 1 birth, 1 child. It was the first official lie in a long history of them. The girls were never formally baptized. Their names do not appear in the town's ecclesiastical record. The still hollow parish registry shows no Delling birth at all in 1874, only a strange footnote beside the 1868 entry for Marian's marriage. A footnote that reads, "Moved to East Ridge, child due by March." It's a dismissal, a deliberate act of looking away. The town's civil ledger is even more silent. It lists no child at all. It's as if the town, the church, the entire system of record-keeping collectively decided that what happened in that cabin during the bone-white storm didn't happen. But it did. And the proof was hidden in plain sight in the small transactions of life. Receipts for milk, for linen, for medicine, kept in an envelope behind a cracked wallboard, all bear dual notations. Delling X2. A whispered historical rumor. They say that on the night of the birth, the old well on the Delling property, which had been dry for a decade, filled to the brim with water that was sweet to the taste but cold as the grave, even in the heat of the following summer. It was Marian who named them, or perhaps she only gave voice to names they already answered to. Echo and hollow, not formal names you'd find in a book but whispers, descriptions of a state of being. She would write about it in the margins of her pocket diaries, the ink bleeding into the cheap paper. One entry, now brittle and stained by water and time, reads, "They arrived during the split. I cannot say which came first, but they do not seem to notice. They breathe differently but think the same." Can you imagine that? To look at your own children and see not two separate souls, but one soul that has been fractured. To see a single thought flicker behind two pairs of eyes at the exact same moment. Neighbors were rarely invited into the Delling home. The isolation began almost immediately. Those who did cross the threshold in those early years spoke of an unnerving stillness. The girls, they said, would always sit facing one another, never speaking, never touching. Yet their small movements were a perfect, silent conversation. If one turned her head, the other would flinch as if she'd felt a touch. One local boy, peering through the window on a dare, described it as watching a single thought pass between mirrors. He didn't know how right he was. The change in Marian herself was profound. Photographs taken of her before the storm show a woman with a straight spine, neat braids, and eyes that were alert, present, fixed on the camera. Later images show a different person entirely. Her posture is slouched, her gaze unfocused, as if she were constantly listening to a conversation no one else could hear, carrying a second self in her own mind. Her very handwriting began to fracture. In her correspondence with her sister, a sister who lived just 2 counties away but might as well have been on the other side of the world, Marian's handwriting began to shift in unsettling ways. Letters started becoming doubled. The letter T would be crossed twice. The letter O would be circled again and again. Sentences would begin normally, then suddenly mirror themselves halfway through, the words turning back on themselves as if trying to return to their origin. Her final letter, a letter that was never sent, was found tucked inside a hymnal years after her death. It contains only a single line, repeated over and over, filling the entire page, the pressure of the pen getting harder with each repetition until it tore through the paper. They do not echo, they speak at once. This wasn't a mother's observation anymore. It was a plea, a confession. Medical logs from the local clinic show no record of any Delling children ever being treated. It's another blank space, another deliberate omission. However, Dr. Callum, the town physician, kept a private black ledger for his more unusual observations, for the cases that didn't fit neatly into his medical textbooks. In an entry dated May 1874, just months after the birth, he writes, "Patient claims twin daughters born during storm. No clear physical trauma, but one child presents with bruises not observed at birth. Claims mirror injury from other. Diagnosis withheld." The entire entry is scratched out with heavy ink, but if you hold the page up to a candle, you can still read the words. He saw it. He knew something was wrong, but he chose to erase it. The first true anomaly, the one that went beyond strange behavior and into the realm of the impossible, came not in speech or movement, but in breath and in blood. A neighbor, a kind woman named Mrs. Clergymen, was asked to look after the girls during a brief illness that struck Marian. It was Mrs. Clergymen who first witnessed the physical link, the terrifying, undeniable connection that bound them together. She reported that if one girl, sitting quietly in a corner, held her breath, the other, playing across the room, would gasp for air, her chest heaving. If one of them accidentally pricked her finger on a sewing needle and cried out, the other's skin would grow red and welted, as if from some unseen strike. Honestly, what would you do? How do you explain that? It was Mrs. Clergymen who, in an act of what she probably thought was common sense, tried to separate them while cleaning the cabin. She led one girl, Echo, out to the garden to pick beans, leaving Hollow inside. She turned her back for no more than a minute, and when she turned back, both girls were standing behind her. Both were perfectly silent, but there was mud on the hem of Echo's dress from the garden and a thin line of blood along the sleeve of Hollow's. No one spoke of the girls after that. The story spread not as gossip, but as a warning. The Delling house became an island. And when the census men came knocking the following year, their horses skittish and uneasy on the path, Marian Delling stood in the doorway and reported only one child. But a photograph remains. A single, brittle, scratched photograph, hidden for a century behind a loose frame in a dusty church attic. It shows two girls, side by side, identical down to the last detail. But only one of them casts a shadow. And no one, not even the midwife who was there at the beginning, ever signed a birth certificate. A chilling visual description. Imagine the photograph. The sepia tones are faded, the edges curling. The two girls stand in front of the dark wood of the cabin. Their faces are identical, impassive. But as you stare, you notice the light source is from the left, casting long shadows of the trees behind them. The girl on the left casts a faint but correct shadow of herself on the ground. The girl on the right, there is nothing. The ground where her shadow should be is clean, bright, as if the light is passing straight through her. The Pine Brush Schoolhouse Ledger for the year 1881 is a model of rural bookkeeping. It lists 27 students enrolled across 3 grades. Under the letter D, only one name appears, Eliza Delling, age 7. The entry is neatly written, initialed by the teacher, and matched with a single tuition payment from Marian Delling. $4 silver for the quarter. A simple, irrefutable fact. But in every surviving class photograph from that period, 2 identical girls appear. They are always seated side by side, their ribbons tied in the same way, their postures a perfect mirror of one another. The same quiet, watchful expression rests on both their faces, passive, yet faintly alert, as though they are listening to something inward, something far more interesting than the day's lesson. Miss Hester Combes, the schoolmistress from 1878 to 1885, was a woman of logic and order. She left behind a slim teaching log, found decades later in the damp basement of the old county records hall. Its pages are stained and frayed, but her script is legible, and it tells a story of profound unease. In a dated entry from late autumn she writes, "She came alone today, or perhaps not. The room was colder than usual. She would not meet my eyes unless I turned my head slightly, as though there were 2 of her and I had to choose which one to see." Think about that. A teacher, a figure of authority, forced to participate in this illusion, forced to choose which reflection to acknowledge. Other entries hint at even stranger occurrences. Pencils rolling off desks before fingers could reach them. Chalkboards bearing words that had not yet been spoken aloud. Miss Combes noted that spelling tests would sometimes be returned with 2 sets of answers in the same, precise handwriting. One correct set on the front of the slate, and a second, slightly different set, on the reverse. On the rare days when Eliza was marked absent in the official log, the other children reported an unusual stillness in the classroom. "The room goes flat," one child told her mother, the words preserved in a local oral history project. "She just looks forward like she's waiting for the other to catch up." The attendance logs themselves tell a curious story. Of all the students, only Eliza's entries appear to be written in a second ink, a lighter shade, almost a tracing over the original mark. And while her name is repeated each day, no date ever bears the final mark, Delling, absent. She was always present, even when she wasn't there. When questioned in her old age, long after the school had been torn down and the memories had faded into local myth, Hester Gomez confessed something she'd never written down. "I stopped calling her name after the third year," she admitted, her voice thin as onion skin. "One was enough. They always answered together anyway." This decision, as informal as it was, reflects a quiet, communal denial that was threaded through so much of life in these isolated places. The 1880 census lists Marian Delling with one daughter, Eliza, but the ledger from the general store shows regular purchases of matched clothing, doubled in size but always paid for in single sums. A receipt from December 1882 notes, "2 dresses, lace trim, identical cut, delivered to East Ridge. Buyer insisted on identical buttons down to the stitch." Everyone knew, and everyone agreed not to know. If you've come this far, comment "The truth bleeds through" below. You're not just watching a story. You're uncovering a history that was meant to stay buried. The students from that period remembered the girls only faintly, like a dream you can't quite hold onto after waking. "There were two," one old man later said in a county interview, his voice thick with the years. "But only one ever stood up when called. The other just watched. We didn't ask why. You just didn't. Some things you learn to leave alone." There is one surviving photograph from that year, the only one that is actually labeled. Beneath the two identical figures, a single name is written in faded ink: Eliza. When this photograph was examined under magnification decades later, it revealed a subtle, almost imperceptible distortion. The background behind one girl, the wooden floorboards of the schoolhouse, aligns perfectly. But behind the other, the boards shift. They seem to warp slightly, as if the very fabric of the room had to bend to make space for her. As if she was an imposition on reality itself. And in the archived school ledger right below Eliza's name, there is a thin, pale gap. A space where another entry might have once existed, scraped out so finely and so completely that even the fibers of the page seem to have been erased. No correction was ever logged. No second name ever entered. And yet the desks remained. 2 desks. There was always a second desk. It was that second desk and what was found inside it that would eventually unravel everything. A desk built by hand, from pine wood smoothed by decades of soft cloth and candle ash. And when the Delling home was finally dismantled in 1912 by state surveyors, one of its drawers resisted removal. It was locked from the inside, though there was no keyhole, no mechanism to explain how. A disturbing real-world quote from the private journal of a 19th-century physician, Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, known for his work on nervous diseases. "There are phenomena of the body and mind that seem to mock our instruments and our theories. In these cases, the physician must become a silent witness to a conversation he cannot hope to understand." When the surveyors finally forced the drawer open, they found it. Wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine lay the private diary of Marian Delling. The ink was faded but dry. The entries spanned nearly 2 decades. No titles, no dates, no greetings, just a mother's observations of 2 girls moving as one. The handwriting is careful at first but inconsistent. At times, Marian writes in the present tense, describing her daughter's gestures with a kind of maternal restraint. Hollow sits by the fire. Echo feels the warmth. Elsewhere, the tense shifts to the future or the conditional, as though she were remembering something that hadn't yet happened. "She will be restless tonight. The other will remember why." In several places, a sentence begins in the singular form and ends, without warning, in the plural. She is dreaming of a place she's never gone, but they remember the way. The earliest entries record what might be dismissed as minor anomalies, a finger twitching in one girl as the other falls asleep. Shared illnesses with offset symptoms. One gets the fever, the other gets the chills a day later. A bruise that appears on one child's arm hours after the other child is startled by a falling branch. You could explain it away. You could try. But as the months turn into years, Marian's tone changes. She stops writing like a mother cataloging oddities. She becomes a witness, not quite reliable, to something that is slowly, methodically unraveling across the page. One passage, written in an almost perfect, steady cursive, reads, "When they sit beside the stove, one hums a song and the other begins to mouth words she does not know. She seems aware of the tune only after it has ended." That last phrase is underlined. twice. Later, Marian records what she calls the bleeding. On several nights, she notes that one child suffered intense nosebleeds after the other woke from a nightmare, though no dream was ever recounted. They cry with one body but bleed with the other, she writes. I cleaned her face while the other watched. She was not scared, only annoyed, as though it had been her turn and she missed it. Can you imagine that? Not fear, not sympathy. Annoyance. As if pain was a resource they were supposed to share equally. The very structure of the diary itself begins to reflect her disorientation. Pages are mirrored. Some entries begin at the left margin as normal. Others begin at the right, the words curving inward like a reflection folding in on itself. A linguistic analysis conducted by a skeptical academic in the 1970s revealed that certain phrases, when read backwards, contain altered, more sinister meanings. For example, the simple sentence, "She is not alone," becomes, "One alone is she." It's a code, a secret language she was developing to try and make sense of the impossible reality she was living in. Between the narrative entries, Marian occasionally inserts notes that resemble patient charts. Dates, symptoms, durations, observations. She measures their pulse and their temperature, as though trying to ground herself in empirical, scientific detail. These notations often follow moments of high emotion, moments of terror. One such line, boxed in with a shaky pencil line, reads, "When one feels pain, the other rubs her knee before the first speaks. Reflexes are not delayed. They are misplaced." It was a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had abandoned it, but the final pages of the diary are unlike the rest. The final pages are a descent. The ink has been pressed hard into the paper. The letters are uneven, frantic. The margins are filled with redacted lines, words crossed out, burned at the edges with a candle flame, or overwritten with layers of graphite until they are illegible. Yet beneath the smudges, archivists using infrared light were able to identify one repeated phrase, faint but unrelenting. They are beginning to switch. What switching meant is never clarified. But in the final, terrifying entry, Marian's restrained tone completely collapses into something close to panic. "The wrong one came down the stairs today," she writes. "She wore the other's dress and tied the ribbon on the wrong side. When I asked her name, she smiled. But it was the wrong smile." No concluding sentence follows. There is only a single dark blot of ink pressed into the corner of the page, round, deliberate, as if made by a fingertip rather than a pen. A final, silent punctuation mark on a story she could no longer tell. There are no further records of Marian's handwriting in any known correspondence. No more letters to her sister. No more entries in the diary. And the desk drawer, the one that held this terrible secret, it was found locked again the following May by a cousin who came to check on the family. Locked from the inside. The secrets were sealed away once more. And soon after, the girls themselves would be sealed away too. A whispered historical rumor. Some of the older folks in the next hollow over used to say that you could tell which girl was present by watching the chickens in the yard. When one was dominant, they'd peck and scratch as normal. When the other took over, the chickens would stand perfectly still, all facing the house, as if waiting for a command. The second floor of the Delling cabin was never meant for long-term habitation. The slanted roof pressed down on the boards like a closing jaw, and the narrow staircase, built by hand from split oak, was steep enough to deter anyone but the most determined. Yet sometime in the winter of 1883, the twins, now 9 years old, were moved upstairs, and they were sealed in. A carpenter's mark, still visible today beside the doorframe, shows the clear outline of a square nail head. It had been driven through the frame from the outside. The wood still holds the ghost of that iron, a dark stain of rust and time, though the nail itself is long gone. There is no formal record of this confinement, no mention in school absences because Eliza no longer attended, no church notices, no entries in the local gossip sheets. But the oral history, the stories collected from neighbors in 1951, suggests that by the age of 9, the girls were no longer seen beyond the window. They had vanished from the world. Deliveries of flour and salt were left on the stoop. The store ledger for the Delling household began to list odd duplicates, identical books, matching pairs of gloves, preserved lemons always counted out in pairs. Inside the house, it seemed the twins remained together. Outside, they had ceased to exist. You're not just watching this, you're becoming part of it. The questions this story raises are questions about our own reality. What if identity isn't as solid as we think? What if the person in the mirror isn't just a reflection? Visitors who dared to step into the Delling home during those years spoke in hushed tones about sounds from above. Rhythmic knocks, not frantic, not a plea for help, but deliberate, measured. Two knocks, then a pause, then two again. A constant, repeating pattern. One man described them as being like breathing if breathing were made of wood. The pattern never changed. It didn't escalate into a desperate banging. It simply returned, day after day, until those who came to visit learned not to look up at the ceiling. They learned to ignore the quiet, wooden heartbeat of the house. A surviving entry in the journal of Reverend Alton Pike, who ministered in the still hollow parish from 1879 to 1887, details a house call he made following a brief illness of Marian's. He notes her pallor, her reluctance to speak, and the unnatural chill that seemed to rise up through the floorboards. He writes, asked of the children. She gestured upward. I heard nothing until she opened the stove door to add a log, then a knock, then another. It was not a summoning, it was an acknowledgement. They knew he was there. They were responding to a change in the house's energy. The attic window remained uncovered during those years, a single, unblinking eye looking out over the hollow. And once, a neighbor named Thomas Urey, then just a boy of 12, climbed a low ridge near the Delling house to retrieve a wayward goat. From that vantage point, he claimed to have seen them. He said he saw the girls through the grimy pane of glass, sitting cross-legged on the floor, directly across from one another. Their hands were clasped between them and their heads were tilted in perfect symmetry. He told his father later that night, his voice trembling, that they weren't looking at each other but through each other. He said, they looked like they were listening to something from the middle. This report was dismissed as childish fancy, a boy's overactive imagination. Until decades later, when the Delling cabin was surveyed for demolition. A single photograph was taken from that very same window, and it is preserved today in the county archive. It shows the room stripped bare, and on the floor there are two worn circular indentations in the wood, exactly opposite one another. Beneath a set of nails protruding from the far wall, and between them, etched faintly into the wood, is a circle, not drawn, not carved. It was rubbed into the grain as though the twins had passed something, a stone, a coin, something, between them for years, back and forth, until the wood itself remembered the motion. No explanation was ever given for why the room was nailed shut, nor when the door was finally unsealed. In fact, no document ever states that it was. But in the spring of 1892, a brush fire swept the ridge behind the Delling home, and local men came to help. One of them entered the house through the unlocked front door and described the second floor as being too quiet for its own shape. And near the doorframe, just below the old nail holes, he found the outline of two fingerprints pressed side by side into a patch of soft pine resin, long since cooled and hardened. One print faced forward. The other was in reverse. A chilling visual description. Picture the two fingerprints in the amber-colored resin. They are small, childlike. The one on the left shows the familiar whorls and ridges of a thumbprint pressed forward. The one on the right is its perfect opposite. Not a different print, but the same print, as if seen in a mirror. As if someone had pressed their thumb through the wood from the other side. In the harsh winter of 1887, a physician passing through the southern edge of Still Hollow requested an unusual favor. His name is recorded inconsistently in a traveling apothecary's log. It was either Dr. Ellison Key or Quint Ellison. Both names appear in county ledgers from that period, but neither is associated with a formal medical license, only a provisional certificate that was filed in Lexington and then quickly withdrawn. He was a man operating in the shadows of established medicine. He claimed to be studying paired anomalies among rural populations, a phrase that appears once in the quarterly bulletin of the Southern Medical Reform Society before vanishing from print altogether. Dr. Key had heard the rumors. From a patient in a neighboring hollow, He'd heard whispers of the Delling twins, of mirrored gestures, of interrupted breathing, of a child who would wince in pain moments before her sister fell. His visit was not solicited by Marian. It was arranged through an intermediary, a local schoolmaster whose journal later included the chillingly detached phrase, "Let science, not superstition, settle what the pulpit will not name." What Marian was promised in return for her cooperation is unclear, but what occurred that day remains partially preserved in the physician's field notebook, a notebook that was later salvaged, burned at the edges and heavily water-damaged by his apprentice. The experiment was terrifyingly simple in its design. One girl, presumed to be Eliza, was taken to a nearby barn, roughly 40 yards from the Delling home. She was escorted with her eyes covered and seated on a wooden stool. The other twin remained in the house, under the doctor's direct observation. Marian did not object. She simply stood on the staircase, a silent sentinel, refusing to speak for the entire duration of the experiment. According to the physician's fragmented notes, once the girls were separated, the twin left inside the house exhibited a sudden and total stillness. Her breathing, he noted, ceased within minutes. Her pulse, checked at the wrist and neck, was absent. Her eyes remained open, unblinking, fixed on a point on the far wall. The doctor recorded her body temperature dropping by 3 degrees in less than an hour. Yet her body showed no rigor mortis, no pallor of death. It was, as he wrote, as though a machine had been paused, not broken, suspended. She was alive but not living. After 2 hours of this terrifying stasis, the girl in the barn began to weep without any prompt. Her tears were not continuous but came in shallow waves, with long, silent pauses in between. She did not speak. She did not ask to return to the house. The nurse who sat with her noted that she seemed acutely aware of something happening elsewhere. When a door creaked open in the distant house, the girl in the barn turned her head in that direction. They were reunited just before sunset. They did not rush to each other. They approached slowly, cautiously, and when their hands finally met, one reaching first, the other waiting, both of them collapsed to their knees and cried. The sobbing was discordant, overlapping as though 2 separate, terrible stories were being remembered at once. And then the bleeding began. One girl, again assumed to be Eliza, began to emit blood from her nose, then from her eyes. Within minutes her ears followed. The blood was thin and watery. The physician did not intervene. He watched, he documented, and then he closed his bag. Dr. Key did not invoice the family. He returned to his rented quarters above the mercantile shop that same evening and remained there, locked in, through the next morning. The shopkeeper reported hearing the sound of tearing paper and the crackle of the fireplace all through the night. The doctor was destroying his own research, erasing the evidence of what he had witnessed. He left town before dawn, leaving his medical instruments behind. His name never appears in any further medical directories. When contacted years later by an academic conducting a survey on anomalous childhood memory, he refused to speak and returned the letter unopened. Only one sentence, scrawled in graphite on the final, surviving page of his salvaged log, offers any closing remark. Not separation, it reads, but interruption. She was not missing. She was waiting. He understood. To separate them was not to move 2 people apart. It was to interrupt a single circuit. The trace of the nurse who assisted him vanished. The barn has since collapsed, but the field where the event took place was later used to plant willow trees. And today, one row of those trees grows taller than the rest, their branches angled, curved slightly inward, as if they are still bending towards something that once sat in the very center of that field. The land itself remembers the interruption. It remembers the waiting. A disturbing real-world quote from the case files of French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, 1903. Some memories do not belong to the individual, but to the family system. They are inherited like a piece of furniture, and the patient does not know why the room feels so crowded. Among the final entries in Marian's second notebook, a smaller leather-bound ledger discovered beneath a false bottom in that same locked drawer are a series of incomplete phrases. They are written in faint charcoal pencil, the handwriting deliberate but lacking her earlier confidence. The phrases seemed to float on the page without context, under breath, between hours. One entry, repeated over several pages, reads, "They speak when not awake. It is not a language for the day." What Marian believed she was witnessing in the dark remains uncertain. The twins, now approaching adolescence, had grown quieter in their waking hours. Visitors noted that they no longer answered questions unless prompted in unison. When separated for chores, they moved listlessly, their actions slow and incomplete, as if they were a machine running on half its power. But at night, something changed. Their sleep, according to Marian's terrified notes, was no longer passive. Their mouths would move in perfect tandem. They would murmur, not the incoherent mutterings of dreamers, but as if they were reciting something. The sounds were first mistaken for humming, then names, and eventually entire phrases, tonal, low, and rhythmic. By candlelight, Marian attempted to transcribe these nocturnal recitations. Most lines defied conventional grammar, but she persisted. Over time, driven by some instinct she couldn't explain, she began copying them down backwards. When reversed, many of the phrases resembled fragments of scripture, specifically Psalms and portions of Ecclesiastes, but subtly altered, as if translated across languages that are no longer used. As if they were remembering a version of the text that was older than the one written down. One phrase, when rendered in this fashion, read, "He will not lead them beside still waters, he will unmake the shepherd." She didn't tell the girls what she was doing, what she was hearing, but they knew. They began waking at the exact same time each night, between the second and third hour past midnight. They would rise from their beds without instruction, return to them, and lie perfectly still, their eyes open in the darkness. No further movement, no noise. Only a silence that was dense and watchful, like the absence of breath in a sealed room. In a letter that was never sent, Marian wrote to her cousin in Ohio, "They are quiet now, but it is not peace. I fear the silence more than the speech." When Reverend Pike was informed of these nocturnal behaviors by a concerned neighbor, his reaction was swift but restrained. He did not accuse Marian of witchcraft publicly. Instead, he visited the home unannounced and requested to speak with the girls. They did not answer him. He stood in the main room and read aloud from the book of Job, his voice filling the small cabin. The girls turned toward him in perfect symmetry, but they never opened their mouths. That night, the Reverend returned to his chapel and tore 3 pages from his personal homily journal. The pages were later recovered from the ashes in his stove. One charred fragment bore a single line in the Reverend's panicked handwriting. "They are in violation of natural order." Within the month, Pike requested formal permission from the regional church council to perform a rite of exorcism. He cited precedent from a disputed case in Mississippi involving a boy who allegedly spoke Latin in his sleep. Local church council declined the request. Their official reason was a lack of observable possession. They needed to see the devil, and all they saw were 2 quiet, strange girls. Marian, when she was informed of the Reverend's attempt, responded with a short note of her own delivered to the chapel by a neighbor's boy. "They are not possessed," she wrote. "They are too alike for evil to take sides." Think of the profound, terrifying truth in that statement. Evil to take hold needs a division, a crack to get in. But what if there was no division? What if there was only one soul, one will, occupying 2 spaces? The journal of Marian's notes ends shortly after this. Her final entry on the subject is unsigned and unfinished. The handwriting appears hurried, the graphite smudged. It reads, "Last night one spoke alone, I could not tell which." The other was silent, but her lips moved to match the unheard words. The notations of their nighttime language were stored in private family collections until 1954, when they were cataloged by a distant niece and filed away in the county archive under the bland heading, "Private Religious Materials, Untranslated." But one archivist, years later, claimed that when he read the notes aloud in reverse in the silence of the record's room, the final phrase seemed to echo behind him. Not in a voice, but in a rush of cold air, in a sudden drop in pressure. A breath, like something being said again, before it had ever been spoken the first time. A whispered historical rumor. Local legend holds that after Reverend Pike's visit, the church bell would sometimes ring twice in the dead of night, with no one near the bell rope. The sound was said to be dull and flat, as if the bell were acknowledging a presence rather than calling the faithful to prayer. The Halleridge Rest Home for Nervous Afflictions opened in the spring of 1886, built on the former site of a shuttered textile mill. It was designed in the prevailing Kirkbride style. Its long, central halls and symmetrical wings were believed to promote balance and order in the disordered mind. It was a place of science, of reason, a place meant to fix what was broken. The intake ledger from 1891 shows a familiar name, entered in faded ink between a woman listed as melancholic and another marked widow, delusional, Marian Delling, age 39. The reason for her commitment was written in the neat, clinical script of the head physician, Dr. Alwyn Gasp. Believes daughters are one mind inhabiting two forms. His private notes describe a woman who was neither violent nor hysterical, but convinced of the impossible in a way so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it unsettled the listener more than any madness would. Marian did not resist her admission. She brought no luggage. When the intake nurse asked her to name her next of kin, she replied only, "They are not separate." In her first week, Marian remained mostly silent. Nurses noted that she ate methodically, avoided all windows, and would often sit in her chair facing the corner of her room for hours on end. On 3 separate occasions, she was found whispering, but not to herself. Her voice, as recorded in the staff log, was described as measured and directed, as if offering instruction to someone standing behind her. No visitors came. No mail was received. The world had forgotten her, but she had not forgotten what she'd left behind. Her condition, as the hospital defined it, worsened over the weeks. When addressed directly, she would fail to respond unless the speaker stood between her and the corner wall she was so often facing. During medical evaluations, she showed no signs of physical decline. Her blood pressure was stable, her pulse was regular, her appetite unchanged. But she began refusing to sleep. When she was sedated, she would weep silently in her cot, her mouth forming words no one could transcribe. Her vocal cords remained still. Only her lips moved, shaping a silent conversation. One evening in October, a young nurse named Miss Cora Bell reported hearing humming from Marian's cell. A single-note melody, she said, repetitive and childlike. When the nurse questioned Marian about it the next morning, Marian answered without looking at her. "They sing it together. It keeps them awake. One sings in breath, the other in memory." The melody, when played on a piano by a curious attendant, produced no reaction from Marian. She only responded to the version that was sung in near silence, just under a whisper, just above a breath. It wasn't the notes she recognized. It was the space between them. By November, she had become nearly catatonic. Her eyes would follow no one. Her body stiffened into unnatural postures, as though she were bracing for an impact no one else could see. And yet each morning, the staff would find her seated upright in her bed, her thin blanket neatly and perfectly folded at the foot. No one on the staff ever admitted to arranging it. Her door remained locked from the outside. The key remained signed out under Dr. Gasp's name, and his name alone. In her final week, Marian ceased eating. She would accept water, but only when it was poured from a child's tin cup that had been found among her few belongings. Her hands, once so neatly folded in her lap, now trembled constantly at rest. On the 5th night of her fast, a nurse discovered markings above the headboard of her bed. 2 circles, uneven but deliberate, had been drawn on the plaster. They were joined by a single, wavering line. The markings appeared to have been drawn in dried blood. The source of the blood was never determined. Marian had no visible wounds, no cuts, no scratches. The hospital log for December 7, 1891, states simply, "Patient expired during evening hours." No final words. No official cause of death was ever recorded, beyond a vague, general failure of systems. Dr. Gasp did not request an autopsy. He left the institution 3 months later and took a position in a remote mining town in Idaho, where his name never again appeared in any medical literature. He ran. Marian's room was cleaned, repainted, and reassigned within a week. But according to staff reports that circulated for years after, The markings above the bed kept bleeding through the fresh plaster. After the third coat of paint, the wall was replaced entirely. And still, beneath the new layer of horsehair and lime, one nurse claimed she could sometimes see two faint circles when the afternoon sun hit the plaster just right. On her death certificate, the field labeled "Surviving Family" was left blank. As far as the world was concerned, Marian Delling had died alone, leaving nothing and no one behind. A chilling visual description. Imagine that asylum room. Stark white walls, a single iron-frame bed. The only color is the faint brownish stain on the wall above where the headboard would be. It's not a clear image, more like a watermark. Two circles linked. It doesn't fade, but it doesn't get darker. It just remains, a permanent whisper in the plaster, a testament to a connection that even death and a new wall couldn't fully erase. By the spring of 1892, the Delling property had gone completely quiet. Neighbors claimed the chimney stopped smoking by March. The last milk delivery recorded in the ledger of the local store was never collected from the porch. The children had not been seen for months, and their mother, Marian, had been committed the year before. The house was an orphan. By autumn, a local circuit judge, citing abandonment, authorized the home to be surveyed and assessed for potential auction. But a problem arose. No one from the parish, nor from the county registrar, could determine who, if anyone, had legal right to sell the land. The paperwork was a knot of contradictions and omissions. When the county surveyor finally arrived, he brought with him two men to assist in clearing the overgrown brush. The front door was unlatched. Inside, a thick layer of dust had settled like a shroud over every surface. Yet nothing showed signs of disorder or struggle. A chair remained tucked neatly beneath the kitchen table. The hearth, long cold, held a small bundle of sticks, arranged carefully for a fire but never burned. There were no linens on the beds, no cookware in the kitchen, no signs of a hasty departure. There was only the profound stillness of a place that had been waiting without any expectation of a return. But the upstairs door, the door to the room where the girls had been confined, required tools to open. The nails, now oxidized into dark, bleeding streaks, had been driven clean through the doorframe from the outside and then sealed over with pine pitch. It was not a door meant to be opened again. When the men finally pried the door open, the wood groaning in protest, what they found was not a child's room. It was not a bedroom. It wasn't anything that resembled a domestic space. There were no beds, no wardrobe, no toys, no garments. There was nothing except two small wooden chairs low to the ground and hand-fashioned. They were placed in the center of the room, facing one another at a perfect, deliberate distance. Each chair bore the indentation of constant use, but not of age. The grain of the wood where a body would rest against the back was rubbed smooth, as if worn not by the passage of time but by the endless repetition of a single posture. And between the two chairs, lying on the floorboards, was a mirror, or what remained of one. Its frame was scorched along one edge, and the glass itself had partially melted, its surface rippled like water caught in mid-motion. Yet there was no soot on the floor. There were no burn marks on the chairs or on the walls. The mirror had been damaged, but not by a fire that had occurred within the room. It was as if it had been heated from the inside out. Beneath the mirror, etched carefully into the wood, were words, not hastily scratched but incised with precision. "I see her when I close my eyes. I hear her when I forget myself." The sentence was repeated in a mirrored arc along the edge of the floor, so that if you were to stand between the two chairs, you would read it twice, once forwards and once in reverse. The surveyor's assistant, a man named Eli Merton, wrote a brief, bewildered statement for the county's internal report. In it he noted there were footprints in the dust, identical, facing inward as if someone had turned to leave but didn't. The footprints were small, unshod, and perfect. There was no variation between the left and the right foot. It was not, he wrote, two children who had stood there. It was one, reflected with impossible precision. No other personal items were recovered from the house. The rest of the property, the barn, the well, the root cellar, was collapsed and being reclaimed by the underbrush. The house itself was left standing, a silent monument to its own mystery. Over the following decades, Hikers and local vagrants would report seeing a strange light from the upper window at night, even though the glass had long since been removed from the frame. In 1952, during a brief preservation project, the cabin was re-examined. The chairs were still there. The mirror had cracked in 3 new places, forming a web across its rippled surface. The words on the floor remained, but the footprints in the dust were gone. Only the dust itself remained, thick and undisturbed, except for a faint depression in the very center of the room, where something had once sat, facing its own echo. If you feel a chill right now, it's because this story is more than just words. It's an echo from a place where the rules of our world don't apply. Share this with someone who isn't afraid to look into the dark. The Still Hollow Cemetery sits on the northern edge of the old Ridge Road, its fence line buckling inward where the land has begun to sag. Most of the stones are simple, quarried locally, their names etched by hand. Family plots are neat, dates align. The records from the church ledgers match nearly every grave, except for 2. In 1894, a burial was recorded in the chapel's death register. A girl, aged 13. The name listed is Eliza Delling. The cause of death is not specified. The line for the attending physician was left blank. The entry is followed by a brief cryptic note written in an unfamiliar handwriting. Companion to be placed adjacent. No stone requested. That same week, the cemetery ledger shows the purchase of a single plot by an unnamed woman. The payment was made in coin, not by check. The entry is complete in its price and its position in the cemetery, but it omits a purchaser's signature. Another blank space. The gravedigger's logbook from that season, a small leather volume kept in the chapel's toolshed, records 2 interments side by side. But it only lists one name, Eliza. The second grave bears no inscription. The stone is cut from the same local material, it stands at the same height, and it faces the same direction as its twin. But its face is blank. Not weathered, not erased. It was simply never marked. A placeholder for someone who was not formally named, for a life that was not formally acknowledged. It wasn't long before visitors began to speak quietly of the imbalance between the 2 graves. For the first year, both graves lay flush with the ground. But by 1896, the leftmost marker, Eliza, remained perfectly level, while the grave on the right, the blank one, began to dip. At first it was subtle, a simple settling of the ground attributed to soft soil or poor compaction. But by the 3rd year, the blank stone leaned slightly forward, and the earth beneath it had begun to draw inward, forming a shallow depression. No animal burrows were found. No tree roots could be traced beneath it. It was just a quiet, insistent pull, as though the grave were sinking not from the weight of what was above it, but from something loosening beneath. The only indication of a funeral at all appears in a private letter written by a local resident, Margaret Tills, to her sister in a neighboring county. The letter describes a service attended by no more than 5 people, held at dawn, with no spoken words. There was a song, she writes, but it came from no one I could see. It was the same tune they used to hum at the market, the one that stops the moment you try to listen to it. Over the decades, cemetery caretakers attempted to stabilize the sinking plot. Soil was packed in, supports were added. One mason even offered to engrave the blank stone free of charge, to give the grave a name and perhaps some peace. The offer was accepted, but the work was never completed. The night before the scheduled carving, the man reported having a dream in which he watched 2 girls sitting across from one another. One was bleeding from the nose, the other was humming through closed lips. He refused to complete the work. The most recent attempt to update the cemetery records, conducted in 1967, yielded the same impossible result. One name, 2 bodies. No death certificate was ever found for the second twin. A note left in the margin of the final report by a frustrated intern reads in ballpoint pen, "Which one is missing and which one was never counted?" It's the central question, isn't it? Today, the unnamed grave continues to shift. Its edges fold slowly into the earth, as though the soil itself has begun remembering something that the official records were told to forget. The groundskeepers no longer try to fix it. They let it sink. They say it's not settling anymore. They say it's being pulled down. The first restoration attempt came in the spring of 1910. The blank stone beside Eliza's was leaning sharply, the sunken front edge exposing part of its base. The groundskeeper at the time, Morris Welk, wrote in his daily log, "Soil firm by morning, soft again by dusk. Stone won't hold. Lower corner pulling like a drain, but the water line is dry." He chalked it up to ground rot, but he added a strange postscript to his entry. "Eliza's stone hasn't budged." The second repair took place in 1916. A new gravedigger, Hiram Pole, a practical man with little patience for local stories, filled the depression with red clay and tamped it solid. But by July, the ground had slumped again, drawing the heavy clay down at its center. The stone now rested at an unnatural pitch, like a knee bowed inward beneath too much weight. Pole resigned without notice. In a letter he sent to the sexton's wife, he said he'd begun dreaming of two girls who stood on opposite sides of a mirror. They would ask him the same question, in turn. "Which one do you see when you look away?" A disturbing, real-world quote from Carl Jung's writings on the collective unconscious. That which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. The unanswered questions of our ancestors will become our own personal burdens. In 1948, a small, peculiar research study was initiated at Cumberland College, funded quietly through a state university grant. It was titled Parallel Response in Identical Siblings. What remains of it, file folders, intake notes, and a single audio reel, was discovered in 1971, wedged between collapsed shelving and the college's disused records annex. The header on the file reads simply, "Twin Project Whisper Response." The study's purpose was to examine the limits of nonverbal awareness in genetically identical children. 5 sets of twins, aged 9 to 14, were selected from nearby counties. None showed any measurable response to the tests, all except the 6th pair. The 6th pair is referred to in the notes only as Group F, Breathitt County. They arrived with their uncle, a quiet man who recorded their birth time as being the same down to the minute, though the midwife listed on their certificate, a Mrs. J. Delling, was never located. When asked to enter the testing room, the 2 girls stopped at the threshold. One whispered to the other. The researcher present, a Dr. Vera Schultz, recorded the exchange phonetically. The words, when deciphered later and reversed, appeared to form the phrase, "This is where she hears her sister weep." Neither girl would enter the room. When questioned, they described a recurring dream they both had, of one girl crying in a corner and the other kneeling watching blood come up through the floorboards. When asked who the girls in the dream were, they answered in unison, "We can't see their faces, but one is always facing away." The test was canceled. The project was discontinued. Dr. Schultz returned to Maryland, but her personal notes contain one additional entry, scribbled hastily in the margin of a folder labeled Peripheral Data. It reads, "They already knew, not the questions, the room." A schematic of the testing area shows a floor plan. The room where the girls refused to enter had a corner section obscured by old storage bins. Behind it, according to the original building plans from 1893, sat a disused crawl space, sealed in 1911. The space had no lighting, no ventilation, just a floor of aged pine slats and, according to maintenance logs, a faint, persistent smell of iron and wax. The file for Group F was marked missing from the college archives soon after. The final notation comes from the assistant librarian who filed the transfer request. It reads, "Duplicate file not found." No one remembers the 6th pair clearly, but in the staff copy of the facility log, one note remains penciled in the margin beside the intake list. Group F refused entry. Knew the floor. They knew. They felt the history of the place, the echo of another pair of sisters, another sealed room, another story that refused to stay buried. It's as if the trauma of Still Hollow had seeped into the very soil of the region, calling out to those who were tuned to its frequency. In 1983, Margaret Ellen Delling, a retired librarian and one of the last living relatives tied to the Delling line, began compiling a formal genealogy. But she encountered a peculiar interruption, not of missing names but of duplicated ones. The Still Hollow birth registry for 1874 lists only one child, Eliza, but a family Bible discovered in a trunk at an estate sale tells a different story. A baptism is noted for Eliza, followed by a tear in the page where the second name should have been. The ink bleeds faintly into the tear, as if written before the page was ever torn. Frustrated, Margaret arranged to have the known grave, Eliza's, exhumed as part of a university forensic project. The results were not just clarifying, they were shattering. The remains were of a child, approximately 13 years old, but the DNA pulled from both teeth and bone marrow failed to produce a singular match. The mitochondrial profile contained inconsistencies, a misalignment between samples taken from the left and right sides of the body. In short, the skeleton exhibited dual genetic markers. The medical notes remarked, structure suggests two sets of instructions reconciled awkwardly, like stitching from opposite ends of a pattern. The report's addendum, now restricted, reads, I cannot determine whether this body belonged to one twin or both. Marian Delling abandoned her research 3 months later. Her remaining notes were donated to the historical office. Taped to a folder containing the DNA charts was a slip of paper with her handwriting. If one girl cried and the other bled, which one is buried and which one watched? In a quiet corner of the Cumberland County Archive, in a sealed glass case, sits a mid-19th century hand mirror. Its origin is listed as Still Hollow, 1892. It was recovered from the abandoned Delling property, found between two collapsed floor joists beneath the sealed upper room. The internal staff log labels it differently. Artifact 447B, Delling Residence. Observed irregularities under low light. The glass is fogged with age, too soft to reflect with precision, and yet when held up to the light of a candle as documented in 3 separate incident reports, it appears to reflect more than is there. A custodian reported in 1987, when I leaned forward I saw my face, but behind it, too close to be behind it, was another face. Same mouth, same eyes, just reversed, and it blinked first. He requested reassignment. An older note found with the mirror, written on the back of a grocery stub, simply states, mirror from upstairs room, belonged to the one who remained. The one, not a one, as if the writer knew which child was buried and which one had been left behind. The curators, without any formal policy, have declined to polish its glass. When asked why, a former collections manager once replied, because what if it's not dust? And some of the night staff have reported that you don't see the other face when you look in the mirror. You see it for a split second in your peripheral vision, just after you stop looking. A reflection that waits for you to turn away before it moves. What truly happened in that cabin? Was it a genetic anomaly, a shared psychosis born of isolation? Or was it something else, something older, a truth about the nature of identity that our modern world has tried so desperately to pave over? The story of Echo and Hollow is not just a tale of two sisters. It's a story about a crack in the mirror of reality, a place where a single soul could cast two shadows, where a single thought could inhabit two minds, where a single life could be lived in duplicate. They were a closed circuit, a perfect echo chamber, and their existence was a quiet rebellion against the fundamental rule that we are all ultimately alone in our own minds. When Marian wrote, "The wrong one came down the stairs today," she wasn't losing her mind. She was witnessing the final integration, the moment when the reflection and the source became indistinguishable, when the two became one, not by joining but by one simply overriding the other. The question isn't which one survived. The question is, what was it that survived? When one life ends and the other absorbs it, is the survivor still the same person? Or are they something new, something more, or perhaps something less? The sinking grave isn't being pulled down by a body. It's being pulled down by an absence. The lingering, gravitational pull of a life that was erased but not forgotten. A life that now exists only as a memory in the mind of its twin, a ghost in its own machine. The survey crew in 1987, the ones who found the warm stove and the steaming plates of food, they never solved the mystery. But the visitor log by the door held the final clue. One name written 4 times. That name, according to a local historian who gained access to the sealed police report, was simply home. not a person, a state of being. The cabin wasn't empty. It was occupied by something that no longer needed a body. It had become the echo itself. This story, in the end, isn't just about a forgotten family in the hills of Kentucky. It's about the parts of ourselves we don't acknowledge, the shadow that walks beside us, the face in the mirror that blinks a fraction of a second after we do. It's a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and that some histories aren't meant to be read, they are meant to be felt, a cold spot in a warm room, a whisper just beneath the threshold of hearing. What do you think happened to the one who remained? And what do you see just after you look away from the mirror? If you found yourself listening in the silence between these words, then subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more sealed rooms, and we have the keys.